Welcome to the Resource of the Future podcast series, a podcast series by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce that explores the present and the future of Canada's resource sector. Our focus spans the impact of the Fourth Industrial Revolution on the agricultural sector, the evolving relationships of Indigenous communities to the resource sector, to technologies and new business practices that will be vital to our leadership towards a low-carbon economy. Our purpose is to foster a better understanding of how our resource sector binds Canadian communities together, the challenges we face, and the opportunities before us as a nation of builders.
I'm very lucky to have with me today Sarah Fedorchuk. So one of the key objectives of the Resource of the Future podcast is to showcase the role Canada's resource sector plays in supporting innovation, combating climate change, creating partnerships with Indigenous communities, and fostering social and economic development across Canada. Sarah, could you tell us a little bit more about what Mosaic does and its relationship to some of these broader objectives?
Absolutely. So Mosaic is the world's largest fertilizer producer. We produce finished potash and phosphate crop nutrients that are shipped globally to help farmers around the world grow the food the world needs. And our majority of our potash sites are actually located in Saskatchewan, Canada.
So, Sarah, Mosaic recently launched the Dig Deeper campaign. Can you tell us a little bit more about this campaign and also what the potash industry contributes to Canada's economy?
For sure. So the Time to Dig Deeper campaign actually came out of conversations we were having with a variety of stakeholders in Canada. And I think that there wasn't a really good understanding of just how important the potash industry is to Canada. It's the second most valuable mineral export Canada has. And one of the richest ore bodies of potash in the world exists in Saskatchewan. And so it's really a boon for our country to be able to have such a valuable resource. What we're seeing with our regulatory environment, however, is that in the last 5 or 6 years, there's just been a layering of different regulations, all very costly, that's really hampering our ability to be competitive on the global stage. And our biggest competitor in the potash industry is the Russians and Belarusians, who are just closer geographically to some key markets, but also don't have the environmental standards we do. They have a different tax regime. Labor is much cheaper in those regions. And so we're finding that even though we have most sustainably made potash in the world, we're a huge economic driver in the communities where we operate, we necessarily maybe weren't doing the best job at telling that story to our stakeholders. And the Time to Dig Deeper campaign was really created to help remedy that.
I think the layering of regulations has been a key challenge to competitiveness in Canada generally, and this could be all the more acute in our post-COVID recovery. I was interested to learn from the Dig Deeper campaign that fertilizer aids over half of the world's crop yields. Now, climate change may reduce current arable land, and the parallel growth of population could really put future food production under strain. What role can Mosaic play in supporting future food production? And in that context, are there some specific export strategies that perhaps Canada should pursue to address this emerging issue?
Yes, I mean, there's a couple things that Mosaic's doing to ensure that there's a secure food supply globally. We have boots on the ground in a lot of key regions. We encourage our customers to work with our agronomists to ensure that they're using fertilizer appropriately. And one of our big pushes, and it's actually a Made in Canada solution, is our 4R Nutrient Stewardship Program. And so that's really a science-based fertilizer application program, encouraging end users of fertilizer to use the right product at the right rate, right time. And so that really helps mitigate the end use environmental impact of fertilizer production, even though that, it helps increase yield. And so it's really making sure every acre of arable land is being used appropriately and to its maximum capacity. So there's that. The other thing that Mosaic's doing is continual research on new product development. And so, there's a real push in different agricultural regions to have products that meet not just, the potash phosphate demand, but what other micronutrients are lacking from the soil and how can you combine, these main fertilizer products that we produce with other minerals in order to maximize yield on those acres. So there's just a lot of science-based approaches happening right now with fertilizer manufacturing and agriculture, which has been really exciting to see. Mosaic's also really focused on new markets. I think traditionally with potash, people think China and India and Southeast Asia, which is 100% true. But actually, Brazil is one of our biggest and fastest growing markets right now, and they've really become an agricultural powerhouse. And so how do we partner there and to ensure that we're, distributing sustainably made fertilizer into new regions and getting a foothold in all of these new regions that might have not had, up to the minute or the most innovative agricultural practices, and sharing the knowledge that we've learned in our over 60 years of operating history.
Wow, that's really interesting. And yes, I imagine that traditional export markets are starting to be joined by new rapidly growing economies like Brazil, and that probably changes your strategies a little bit. In the discussion so far, you have sort of mentioned the emphasis on innovation and the development of new sciences to aid Mosaic as you continually refine your product. In some ways, I think that innovation is really important, especially as we've seen, there's been a layering of different climate policies. There's signals from the federal and provincial governments to businesses to accelerate the decarbonization. And in many cases, these policy signals have been joined by demands from investors and other stakeholders who wish to see companies achieve greater efficiency and reduce their climate liabilities. Like all mining operations, extracting material from beneath the surface is energy intensive. Can you tell us a little bit about how Mosaic is managing its emission intensity, and also how perhaps, these sort of policies and culture of innovation and new sciences, how does all this relate back to your 2025 GHG targets?
For sure. So, Mosaic definitely understands the importance of mitigating our environmental impact. And we've done intensive studies that actually show that Canadian potash uses 70% less greenhouse gas emissions than our competitors. And so, as we know, climate change doesn't really recognize borders. And so having Canadian potash be as competitive as possible actually has a really great environmental impact globally because of our reduced GHG footprint, our focus on our sustainability and ESG targets. And so, we have made huge progress on reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that come from our operations. But the management of energy intensity can really take place in a lot of different forms. And so not only in our daily operational plans and decision making, but we also have it ingrained in our capital and long-term planning projects. And so on a daily basis, decisions are made regarding different operational aspects to maximize efficiencies. And that can include, we use automation to increase efficiencies, ensuring our equipment is operating at the most efficient capacity as per their engineered design can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And for huge capital projects, the energy efficiency piece is really revisited at the design stage. So when we're looking at future state projects, we are incorporating best available technology and minimizing those energy inputs. And then last but not least, we have our sustainability teams that are in place in our operations and also managed with an executive sponsor. And so these teams are really a conduit for conversation and ideas that, really encourage, quote unquote, out of the box thinking, but also just assist with championing the various ESG initiatives that Mosaic has in place. And so it really has become top of mind. We've seen a real shift in, just even recognition from our frontline about some of these initiatives. And we've also been given the flexibility at Mosaic. We can bring in third-party experts to complete various forms of energy audits and just see where we can get better from an incremental point of view. Some examples would be last year in our Carlsbad potash facility, we upgraded a product dryer. And so when, potash is treated with water, and the dryers tend to be a place where we use a lot of energy. And when we upgraded the product dryer, it reduced the facility's natural gas use and associated emissions by more than 500 tons per year. So, there's some things like that by just upgrading different technology and using best available technology, we've been able to make some real gains.
That sounds like a really significant technological development. And in context of that, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about how reducing GHG emissions and emission intensity fit into a broader and ongoing effort within other dimensions of good corporate stewardship. In particular, I think it's important, that as we sort of see these shifts, that we don't lose sight of the S and G in ESG. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, maybe through the sort of some of your 2025 targets that you've set? And also, related to that, given that the mining sector is already one of the largest private sector employers of Indigenous and First Nations people in Canada, can you tell me about Mosaic's engagement with Indigenous and First Nations communities?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that we're especially proud of is about 4 years ago, we launched a set of Indigenous engagement targets. And frankly, I think before 2017, we had really struggled with how to do outreach into the communities that surround our operation. It was a lot of stop-starting. We weren't, I think, really focused and didn't really know where to start. And so we put a lot of resources behind creating a sustainable and meaningful Indigenous engagement strategy. And so where we've ended up is we have targets in hiring and representation and community investment and outreach, and then procurement and strategic sourcing when it comes to Indigenous engagement. And so by 2025, we intend to have 15% of all new hires in our workforce be from Indigenous descent. We have commitments to work with more Indigenous vendors and also use companies that are also doing a lot of Indigenous hiring and also have Indigenous engagement strategies into place. Some of the, great things that I think that we did was with our community investment budget, we actually worked directly with the communities that surround our operations to do directed funding to where it makes sense for those communities. And so we don't really go in with an agenda, but we listen to the leadership in those communities and figure out where they may have gaps locally and can divert our funding to address those gaps. So sometimes it's infrastructure on reserve, sometimes it's education, sometimes it's food programs, but it actually allows us to have conversations and make actual impact and have it be directed by those communities rather than having, some pre-subscribed targets that we're trying to hit. In addition to our Indigenous engagement, we've already really talked about the reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 20% per ton by 2025, but we have a similar target when it comes to reducing fresh water use by 20% per ton of product by 2025. Some of the targets are more holistic, just eliminating significant environmental incidents, establish company-wide systems for capturing volunteer hours to really, again, ensure that our employees are involved in this journey with us and have the ability to have impact in their local communities. And so this is year 12 that Mosaic has had, a sustainability path or an ESG path, and we just kind of see that we're getting a little more mature with it and really getting more buy-in, I think, from our workforce as well as a lot of our stakeholders.
That's really impressive. At 20% on GHG and 20% on water use reductions by 2025. That's a pretty significant target to pursue. I'm sure, as you know, there's still a ways to go, I think, in establishing trust and understanding amongst the Canadian public on really how innovative and dedicated to the environment Canada's resource sector is. Our companies are strong stewards both here and globally. And I think, this sort of relates back to your broader sort of point you've made about, this is a tight industry. The trade is shaped by, increasing global competitiveness. So, when you look at the metrics on water conservation and mitigated GHGs that Mosaic achieved, how does that compare with the potash producers in Russia?
Yeah, so we are world leading when it comes to our practices, when it comes to our focus on mitigating environmental impact. And the truth is that our competitors globally do not have the same focus on environmental stewardship than we do. And we are really proud of our environmental track record, and really proud of the work that we're doing. However, when you're commodity business competing globally, you're not seeing a price differential for all of the resources you're putting towards being more environmentally sustainable. And so I think that's a real challenge for the Canadian mining industry, because it's not just really the potash sector that has this focus on ESG and mitigating environmental impact. Most Canadian miners or most Canadian companies in the resource sector are doing the exact same thing. And so when you look at some of our competition globally, they are not. However, they are getting, the same price per ton of potash that we would without putting that focus and that attention on environmental stewardship. So I think, from a competitiveness point of view, it is kind of a headwind that we have, that we are more sustainable. I don't think we would want it any other way, but at the same time, not to have it recognized by the end user or getting a price bump for any of that does put us at a competitive disadvantage. And when you add on the extra layering of tax regime, transportation costs, just our distance to our customers, we just really need to have, an awareness that the Canadian resource sector are really good stewards of our resources, and as Canadians, be proud of all the work that goes into making us so.
No, thanks, Sarah. And, on that last point, we've sort of said this already, but, it is a highly competitive global trade. And it's, I think that the IEA, for instance, has identified that COVID-19 has created significant challenges to global investment dollars for resource projects and energy products in particular, but resource projects across the board. Capital is probably going to be scarce. And, you sort of mentioned with, rising transportation costs, the layering costs faced by companies in Canada from certain climate policies that may not have been designed so far in the most efficient way. Given all that, what are some things that the federal government and regulators can do to help Canadian companies get the edge in an increasingly tightening global investment market?
So I think a couple things that regulators can do is really start to champion the Canadian resource sector instead of looking at it as a negative or as something that might be ugly and they don't want to talk about. I think that, there are so many great success stories that have come out of the Canadian resource sector. The Canadian mining industry is the number one employer of Indigenous peoples, for example. We have some of the most robust ESG targets in the world, regardless of industry. And so to really, instead of trying to overregulate us, really start to champion it and give us, some incentives for being stewards of the environment instead of penalizing us for operating. And I think there is not a really good, struggle in the potash industry because we're located in Saskatchewan. So when you have one global industry operating in a smaller jurisdiction, I think sometimes regulators aren't even aware of how harmful some of the layering can be. And so to really kind of have a roll-up or a holistic viewpoint to all of the different things that are happening and do a total kind of economic impact analysis of it instead of kind of rolling things out, piecemeal is really important. I think one thing that we've really appreciated is just the ability for consultation and for the ability to educate different regulators on our industry. And again, that's kind of where the Time to Dig Deeper campaign came in, is really our wish that they understand, I guess, first of all, the whole industry story and have the ability to actually see how we're already leading the world when it comes to environmental stewardship. I will say with COVID-19, it has put a lot of things into sharper perspective. And one of those things is just how important food security is. And so now it's really on us to show how vital the fertilizer industry is to the overall food security story.
That's a great overview, and I think an important message to regulators and government. I agree that COVID-19 has cast those relations of interdependence into sharp relief, and the role that Canada plays in supplying key resources, fertilizers, minerals, metals, forest products, oil and gas products to the world, I think has never been more important. And and is increasingly a very, very clear as sort of a key role that Canada does play and a role that we should continue to play. You know what, though, in this conversation, we have really touched on the challenges. I wonder if we could just end off here with what you believe is the biggest opportunity ahead of the potash industry, and what will it take to realize it?
I think one of our big opportunities is that although we don't get any recognition on the price side for our sustainability story right now, I think that in the next 5 to 10 years, that could really shift. I think that you have a whole generation of producers coming into agriculture that do want to use the most sustainable products that are being mandated by some of their biggest customers to have a more sustainable supply chain. And so although right now our environmental track record puts us at a financial disadvantage sometimes, I can see that shifting. Right now, like 5 years ago, none of our analysts or none of our shareholders were really asking a lot of sustainability stories, and that has started to shift. There's a much bigger recognition with a lot of our investors that environmental stewardship is indicative of other things. So if you have a company that has a real handle on their environmental impact, they probably have a real handle on cost control, and they're probably really innovative and are thinking outside the box. And so I think that short term, we're really constrained on price or what we can ask our customers to pay for a ton of potash. I think eventually we're going to get to the point where Canadian potash is seen as a sustainable choice, and hopefully the price will start to dictate that a little bit.
Thank you for joining us today, Sarah. I know I learned a lot from hearing your perspective on this, and especially sort of those emerging trends, and I'm sure our listeners will too.
Thank you so much. And if anyone's interested in learning more, the website is timetodigdeeper.com. And we really appreciate the chance to just kind of discuss our story and discuss who we are.
I want to thank everybody for tuning into the conversation today. And I hope you want to continue to stay engaged with us as we continue to explore the critical role Canada's resource sector plays in supporting Indigenous communities and business development, creating new technologies that are going to guide our path forward to a lower carbon economy, as well as developing practices of sustainability and innovation. And finally, just understanding the interconnected relationship and interdependencies that make the resource sector in Canada a key driver in social and economic development in small communities and large communities across Canada. And if you liked what you heard, please make sure to check out rotf.ca for new episodes and updates about the sector. If you want to continue to add support to this conversation, please feel free to share this episode on social media and maybe consider using some of these hashtags. Hashtag ROTF, hashtag Resource Champions, hashtag Canada's Natural Advantage. But we also look forward to seeing whatever you come up with as well. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to having you in the conversation in the future.